Hello and welcome to the Wild Side. This is your host, Dr. Caitlin Kite, and you were just listening to Zola Jesus singing In Your Name. And hello and welcome to the Wild Side. This is your host, Dr. Caitlin Kite, and you were just listening to Zola Jesus singing In Your Nature. And that song was selected because today I'm going to be talking about nature. Well, I usually talk about nature, but this time around I'm going to be changing the format a little bit and talking about nature reading. And this is the time of the season when a lot of us are interested in buying presents for other people, and so I thought it would be a good time to think about some of the science and nature writing that I really think is interesting and fun and really intriguing and kind of gets you excited about science and gets you excited about scientific findings. And so I've gone through my library and I've selected some of my favorite nature reading, and I thought that I would share some of these authors and books with you today and read some excerpts from their work to hopefully pique your curiosity and give you a bit of a preview so you can think about whether these things might actually be interesting to people on your Christmas buying list, or perhaps even to yourself. Now, the first person on my list is probably my all-time favorite science writer, and that is David Quammen. And David is someone I've actually had the fortune to meet in person. So a couple of years ago, he came to the university that's in my hometown, and because my dad is a journalist and was going to interview him for that visit, I got to tag along and chat with him myself. And it was a really great experience. He's a really nice guy. And he was actually there during the anniversary of Darwin's publishing of Origin of the Species. And he was talking about a book that he wrote about Darwin in the process of writing that book. But he also told me a little bit about his brand new book, which has just come out this fall, and that's called Spillover. And it's about diseases that can transfer from animals to humans, so zoonotic diseases. And that would be a great thing to read on air. Actually, I just finished reading that myself because I'll be reviewing it for a magazine. But I had to go back and pick the book of his that was the very first one I ever came across, and the one that really got me excited about his writing and really got me to thinking that maybe this was a career that I actually could pursue myself. And funnily enough, I actually did write Mr. Quammen, and I said, I'm really interested in this, I love your work, do you think I could do something like this? And he wrote me back, and we discussed this actually a couple years ago when we talked in person, and he told me then the same thing that he just told me recently, which was that science writing is a really difficult career, and he would only advise that the craziest, most foolhardy, most in love with science people ever pursue that career, because it is really hardcore. And he's been all over the world and has done some really fascinating and exciting stuff and picked up lots of parasites and injuries and all sorts of crazy experiences. So he's definitely someone who knows the hardships as well as the triumphs of that particular career. So without any further ado, I'm going to read an excerpt from my favorite of his books, which is called Song of the Dodo. And this book is about the dodo, of course, itself, which went extinct, and the idea of species that go extinct and the things that we do or do not know about them and the traits that we lose when they leave us. But because of that, it's also kind of more broadly about biodiversity and the little things that we have that all cobble together to make the ecosystem that is our globe. And this is the beginning of his book. Let's start indoors. Let's start by imagining a fine Persian carpet and a hunting knife. The carpet is 12 feet by 18, say. That gives us 216 square feet of continuous woven material. Is the knife razor sharp? If not, we hone it. We set about cutting the carpet into 36 equal pieces, each one a rectangle, 2 feet by 3. Never mind the hardwood floor. The severing fibers release small, tweaky noises, like the muted yelps of outraged Persian weavers. Never mind the weavers. When we're finished cutting, we measure the individual pieces, total them up, and find that, lo, there's still nearly 216 square feet of recognizably carpet-like stuff. But what does it amount to? Have we got 36 nice Persian throw rugs? No. All we're left with is 3 dozen ragged fragments, each one worthless and commencing to come apart. Now take the same logic outdoors, and it begins to explain why the tiger, Panthera tigris, has disappeared from the island of Bali. It casts light on the fact that the red fox, Vulpes vulpes, is missing from Bryce Canyon National Park. It suggests why the jaguar, the puma, and 45 species of birds have been extirpated from a place called Barrow, Colorado Island, and why myriad other creatures are mysteriously absent from myriad other sites. An ecosystem is a tapestry of species and relationships. Chop away a section, isolate that section, and there arises the problem of unraveling. Now, David then goes on for another several hundred pages to talk about all sorts of experiences that he's had around the world in areas where there are animals like the dodo that have disappeared. And it's a really engrossing read, and I definitely suggest it. And other books by him include Natural Acts, Wild Thoughts from Wild Places, Monster of God, and as I mentioned earlier, his most recent book, which is called Spillover. And all of these kind of range from series of essays to actual full-length books, so there's a little bit of everything depending on what your attention span is. Now the next book on my list, and the next author, is someone who probably is second actually on my overall list of favorite science and nature writers, although recently the kind of quality of his work and the types of ideas that he's having, they're not quite up to the same standards of his earlier stuff, I have to say. And I don't know if that's because he's getting on in years or because I'm kind of changing my opinions about things. But that doesn't actually detract from the quality of his earlier stuff and how meaningful and interesting and educational it is. And this person is E.O. Wilson, Edward O. Wilson. And he is an academic who has been at Harvard for several decades now. And my favorite of his books, and actually something that really got me thinking about the possibility that I could be a scientist because science and nature were what I love, is Naturalist. And Naturalist is his biography. And when I was entering college from being a high school student, I had to write a bunch of applications, and I had to write essays in those applications. And one of the essays that I included was the story of my experience of reading this book for the first time and how it kind of changed my life. Because I think, you hear people talk sometimes about things that change their life, and you think, well, I don't know about that. But actually, this is a book that truly did change how I perceived, this hobby that I had of bird watching and being out in nature, and thinking maybe this is actually something that I can do for a full-time career for the rest of my life. So it really made me look at the world differently. And Naturalist talks about E.O. Wilson's own experiences and kind of coming to that same realization himself. And he's someone else that I've actually had the good fortune to meet, and that was really serendipitous because he came to open up a building, a new building that had been built on my college campus when I was an undergrad. And I was able to go up to him after his talk and take to him my book and have him sign it, and he even drew a little ant on the inside cover because he's an expert in ants. So that was really exciting for me. And actually reading the book was quite an interesting thing because my dad happened to get it as a press copy, and I looked at it one day and saw that it had some pretty pencil drawings on the inside, and so I thought, why not? I'll give it a shot. And, here I am today saying that this is something that's changed my life. So here I have picked out a selection from the book where Wilson talks about kind of a seminal experience of his boyhood where he had a really exciting encounter with wildlife that was a bit crazy, a bit dangerous, but kind of primed him to have this sort of lifestyle, actually, for the next several decades where he would spend his time out in the wild doing these fascinating things. I moved into the snake handler's routine, pinned the body back of the head, grasped the neck behind the swelling masseteric muscles, and lifted the snake clear of the water. The big cottonmouth, so calm to that moment, reacted with stunning violence. Throwing its heavy body into convulsions, it twisted its head and neck slightly forward through my tightened fingers and stretched its mouth wide open to unfold inch-long fangs. A fetid musk from its anal glands filled the air. In the few seconds we were locked together, the morning heat became more noticeable. Reality crashed through, and at last I awoke from my dream and wondered why I was in that place alone. If I were bitten, who would find me? The snake began to turn its head far enough to clamp its jaws on my hand. I was not strong even for a boy of my slight size, and I was losing control. Reacting as if by reflex, I heaved the giant out into the brush, and it thrashed frantically away, this time until it was out of sight and we were rid of each other. This narrow escape was the most adrenaline-charged moment of my year's adventures at the hatchery. Since then I have cast back, trying to retrieve my emotions to understand why I explored swamps and hunted snakes with such dedication and recklessness. And E.O. Wilson has lots of other books, actually too many almost to count, and he has tons and tons of scientific articles as well. And I mentioned ants earlier, and he is considered one of the world's foremost researchers in ants, and is one of the people who helped discover the fact that ants are able to communicate with each other using pheromones. And now you can read about that in his kind of seminal work on ants. You can also read a recent novel that he wrote based on his own experiences studying ants as a boy, and that's called Ant Hill. He's written a couple things recently about kind of conservation and the future of life, and one of those is in fact called The Future of Life. Another great one, the one that I actually took to have him sign, is called Consilience, and it's about how all sorts of different fields are actually interrelated. So when you think about philosophy and history and science and all of these things, how they actually impact each other. And another great one that's just kind of fun because it talks about the diversity of life and gives all sorts of examples of the crazy species that are out there is Biophilia. And that's one that actually some college classes will use as well to just kind of get a good overview of the biodiversity present on the planet. Now the next book on my list is something that I kind of stumbled across a few years ago when I was watching, I think it was actually Stephen Colbert. It might have been the Colbert Report or it might have been the Daily Show, I forget which. But this author was a guest and he was on there talking about his new book at the time, and that is called The World Without Us, and the author is Alan Weisman. And he, for some reason, I forget now exactly what happened, but he was inspired to look into some literature that explored what might happen if humans were suddenly absent from the planet. And this is something we see a lot in movies, like I Am Legend is a great example of this. You see the New York landscape without anyone else there. And, you know, lots of people explore this in books and in movies and in comic books, but Alan Weisman wanted to go and actually talk to scientists and kind of think about, based on the research that has been done and the things that we know about places where people have suddenly vanished, what could we expect to happen if humans were no longer around doing things to the environment and building buildings and making the sorts of changes that we make? And so he came away with this book, which was originally, I think, supposed to just be a newspaper article or a magazine article, and he just kept researching and eventually put this together. And this is a little excerpt from near the beginning of the book, kind of his introduction section, I think. And he is talking about, he's just kind of basically summing up what it is that he hopes to discuss in the rest of the book. For a sense of how the world would go on without us, among other places we must look to the world before us. We're not time travelers, and the fossil record is only a fragmentary sampling. But even if that record were complete, the future won't perfectly mirror the past. We've ground some species so thoroughly into extinction that they, or their DNA, will likely never spring back. Since some things we've done are likely irrevocable, what would remain in our absence would not be the same planet we had never evolved in the first place. Yet it might not be so different either. Nature has been through worse losses before and refilled empty niches. And even today, there are still a few earthly spots where all our senses can inhale a living memory of this Eden before we were here. Inevitably, they invite us to wonder how nature might flourish if granted the chance. Since we're imagining, why not also dream of a way for nature to prosper that doesn't depend on our demise? We are, after all, mammals ourselves. Every life form adds to this vast pageant. With our passing, might some lost contribution of ours leave the planet a bit more impoverished? Is it possible that instead of heaving a huge biological sigh of relief, the world would miss us? The world without us would miss us? And he then goes on to talk about all sorts of fascinating things that have happened kind of really by accident. So, for example, an island where no one lives there anymore, but they used to, and so he goes and visits and sees what has happened to the buildings that were there. And he talks about places like Chernobyl, where of course people used to live but then had to leave after the nuclear disaster, and what it looks like now that there are no longer humans there affecting the environment. And it kind of has a bit of a conservation message at the end. And I know that the topic may be sounding a bit morbid because of the way I'm describing it, but actually it's an utterly fascinating book, and I definitely recommend it because it's a very engrossing read and is quite addictive. And before I move on to the next book on my list, we'll have a bit of a break so you don't have to just listen to me talk the whole time. And this will be James Taylor and Alison Krauss singing How's the World Treating You? Welcome back to The Wild Side. This is your host, Caitlin Kite. And today we are talking about science and nature writing in the hopes that I can inspire some of you to pick up some of these books that I'm talking about for yourselves, or maybe for some friends and loved ones that you're buying presents for here in the holiday season. And the next person on my list is Julie Zickafoose, who is an author from my area of America. She's from Ohio. Well, she's not from Ohio, but she lives there. And she lives down in the Appalachian Portion, which is where I am from. And she is an amazing artist and also a writer, and she's a correspondent on National Public Radio, which is a really important kind of radio station in the U.S. And so she does all sorts of things where she talks to people about her love of the outdoors and her knowledge about nature and kind of living in the country and living with nature really close up. And it's actually, I often think her writing is kind of reminiscent of the way that things are here in Cornwall, because I come from a part of the U.S. that's kind of tucked away. It's a bit hard to get to. It's really beautiful. There's a lot of nature around, and there are all sorts of opportunities to observe the wildlife and live up close and personal with the wildlife and kind of live off the land. And Julie's involved in a lot of efforts rehabilitating animals and watching animals and taking care of them. And she wrote a book recently called The Bluebird Effect, and it's a series of essays and also images that she has drawn and sketched. And she has sent me, she's been so kind as to donate an excerpt, and it's from something called Hummingbird Summer, a chapter in her book, The Bluebird Effect. I dread hearing the phone ring in summer, but I always pick it up, because I can help the vast majority of the callers without ever having to pick up the bird. In many cases, they found a feathered fledgling that is supposed to be out of the nest and hopping around on the ground, one that's being tended by its parents and just needs to be put back outside, so it can live out this vulnerable but necessary part of its life cycle. Because I travel a lot, have a family and a career, I need to do other things than feed baby birds. I do what I can to help over the phone. I try to redirect injured birds to the facilities where they can be helped. Occasionally, though, there are calls that demand immediate action, calls that change my life. It's July 9th, 2003. 2 calls come in rapid succession, both from Reno, Ohio. One woman has found 2 nestling hummingbirds in an intact nest on the ground following a powerful thunderstorm. I tell her to tie the nest back up in the sweet gum from whence it came, and call me in an hour if the female hummingbird hasn't returned. I hang up the phone, and another call comes in from another woman in Reno with exactly the same story. Didn't we just speak, I ask? No, it's a second nest with 2 baby hummingbirds inside. I tell her to do the same thing, but her front yard is such a mess that she can't tell from which tree it might have fallen. As I'd done with the first caller, I gave her directions to my house. As it turns out, neither hummingbird mother was able to relocate her young, and both nests, their precious cargo intact, are on my kitchen table within 2 hours. When I see the first one, my hand flies up to cover my mouth, and I gasp. I know intellectually that hummingbirds are small, but these nestlings are so very tiny. After all, they've hatched from eggs no bigger than black-eyed peas. They're in pin feathers, and their eyes are winking open and closed. They're breathing hard and fast. The second nest arrives within a few minutes, and those birds are a few days older than the first 2, with all but their head feathers out of the sheaths. 4 baby hummingbirds, where before there were none. I've never even seen a baby hummingbird up close, and now they're mine to deal with. I am reeling from the thought that these unutterably dear little birds will die unless I figure out how to take care of them. I imagine them, clinging to the walls of their soft, walnut-sized homes as their nests suddenly become space capsules, hurtling downward to a hard landing. I know, looking at them, that my life has suddenly and irrevocably changed, as it would have had I opened my front door and found a newborn baby crying on the stoop. And if you want to find out what happens with those hummingbirds, you will have to get Julie's book. And I hope that you are intrigued enough by that to do it, because it's definitely worthwhile. I have a copy myself. Sadly, my copy is in America, and I need to fetch it back when I go visit over the holiday season. But you can buy from Amazon and also from Julie's website, which I definitely suggest that you check out, because she has also a fantastic blog where she talks about all the things that she does out in her kind of country living lifestyle, and it's really fun and interesting. And as I said, there are many aspects of it that are quite similar to life here in Cornwall. Now, the next person on my list is another female writer, and also someone who is very familiar with living in the wild, living in close proximity to nature and living off the land. So there's kind of a theme here that's emerging in my choices. And this is actually one of my all-time favorite writers, period, and normally she mostly does fictional work, and this is Barbara Kingsolver. And you might be familiar with her name because she has written Flight Behavior, a very recent book, The Lacuna, which also has come out in the last couple of years, The Poisonwood Bible, which I think is one of the most perfect books I've ever read, Prodigal Summer, which is a fantastic book that is fiction, but it also has lots of nature, and it's all about kind of being outside, and it's really great to think about the nice hot summer in a big leafy green forest. And she's also written Animal Vegetable Miracle, which is kind of a recipe book and commentary on her life that she wrote in collaboration with her daughter. But the book that I'm going to read from today is something called Small Wonder, and it's a series of essays that she wrote shortly after 9/11 happened in the U.S., because she was approached by someone to write some commentary about that event. And she was kind of blocked for a while because it was such a huge emotional thing that she couldn't quite think of what to say, and then all of a sudden she just started having one thing after another come out, and she ended up writing a book of separate essays that all kind of touched on this experience. And some of these essays are very tangential when you think about what actually happened at 9/11, but it was just, these were things that were inspired by that event because they made her step back and evaluate her life. And this particular essay that I'm going to read from is one that's actually quite happy in many ways, and certainly this section of it is quite happy. And this is about her experience beginning to have chickens because her young daughter had seen some neighbors and friends that had chickens, and she wanted to keep them as well. And so they've gone out and they have bought chickens and they have set up a coop, and this is what happens. With the coop built and chickens installed, all we had to do now was wait for our flock to pass through puberty and begin to give us our daily eggs. We were warned it might take a while because they would be upset by the move and would need time for emotional adjustment. I was skeptical about this putative pain and suffering. It is hard to put much stock in the emotional life of a creature with the IQ of an eggplant. Seems to me you put a chicken in a box and she looks around and says, "Gee, life is a box." You take her out, she looks around and says, "Gee, it is sunny here." But sure enough, they took their time. Lily began each day with high hopes, marching out to the coop with cup of corn in one hand and my 20-year-old wire egg basket in the other. She insisted that her dad build 5 nest boxes in case they all suddenly got the urge at once. She fluffed up the straw in all 5 nests, nervous as a bride preparing her boudoir. I was looking forward to the eggs, too. To anyone who has eaten an egg just a few hours removed from the hen, these white ones in the store have the charisma of day-old bread. I looked forward to organizing my family's meals around the pleasures of quiches, Spanish tortillas, and soufflés, with a cupboard that never goes bare. We don't go to the grocery very often. Our garden produces a good deal of what we eat, and in some seasons, nearly all of it. This is not exactly a hobby. It's more along the lines of religion, something we believe in the way families believe in patriotism and loving thy neighbor as thyself. If our food ethic seems an unusual orthodoxy to set alongside those other two, it probably shouldn't. We consider them to be connected. And she then goes on to talk about some of the advantages of producing food in your own backyard and how that's a useful thing in terms of health, but also the economy, and also, of course, ecosystem health, which is something I've talked a little bit about on the show before. Now, switching gears a little bit, this next book is something that I also read in college shortly after I read The Song of the Dodo, which is that first book that I read an excerpt from today. And this is another thing that I happened to just kind of stumble across in my college bookstore, and I've always been very happy that I did. It actually is something that wound up winning the Pulitzer Prize, but I had no idea of this at the time. I just thought it seemed exciting because it had a bird's name in the title, and everyone knows by now that I'm a bit obsessed with birds. And this particular book is called The Beak of the Finch, and it's written by Jonathan Weiner. And he has written this book about the finches that Darwin ran into in the Galapagos, and they're called Darwin's finches. And according to the story, although it may or may not be actually this cut and dry, but Darwin noticed all of these finches that were pretty similar in many respects, and they're very closely related, but they all have different types of beaks that allow them to eat different types of foods. And supposedly he saw these finches and was struck with the inspiration to think about natural selection and evolution. And whether or not that's true is kind of up for debate, but there are some people who have studied these birds because they are quite fascinating and they are very useful and tell us a lot about evolution. And the two primary people who have done this are Peter and Rosemary Grant, and they have also a lot of students that have come to join them over the years. And Jonathan Weiner has gone out and spent quite a lot of time with the Grants, and he has looked at the work that they've done, and he describes it in this book. And this is a section from pretty close to the beginning of the book where he's kind of introducing what it is that the Grants do and what it is that they're studying. 7:30 on Daphne Major. Peter and Rosemary Grant sit themselves down on stones, a few steps from the traps. Peter opens a yellow notebook with waterproof pages. "Okay," he says, "today is the 25th. It is the 25th of January, 1991. There are 400 finches on the island at this moment, and the Grants know every one of the birds on site, the way shepherds can tell every sheep in their flocks. In other years there have been more than 1,000 finches on Daphne Major, and Peter and Rosemary could still recognize each one. The flock was down to 300 once. The number is falling toward that now. The birds have gotten less than 1/5 of an inch of rain in the last 44 months. In 1,320 days, 5 millimeters of rain. The Grants and the Grants' young daughters, and a long line of assistants, keep coming back to this desert island like sentries on a watch. They have been observing Daphne Major for almost 2 decades, or about 20 generations of finches. By now, Peter and Rosemary Grant know many of the birds' family trees by heart. Again, like shepherds, or like Bible scholars, who know that Abraham begat Isaac, and Isaac begat Jacob, and Abraham also begat Jokshan, who begat Dedan, who begat Asherim, Letzushem, and Lumen. In each generation there are always a few birds, just 1 or 2 in 100, that keep away from the Grants and refuse to be caught. This morning Rosemary, after a week of watching and plotting, has just captured 2 of the wariest, most difficult finches on the island. She caught them both in the space of a single minute, high on the island's north rim, next to a fallen cactus pad, in black box traps baited with green bananas. "How about that?" she cried, when the trap's doors clicked shut. And when Peter strode through the cactus trees and across the lava rubble to join her, Rosemary lifted up her first prize, fluttering in a blue pouch. "I deserve a bottle of wine for this." Now, again, to switch gears completely, but still kind of dealing with animals, I have a book that I was lucky enough to be contacted to review last year, and this is called The Great Animal Orchestra, Finding the Origins of Music in the World's Wild Places. And someone decided that I should be sent this because I study noise. I study the effects of anthropogenic noise on birds and bird communication. And so this person at a publishing company was looking for people to talk about this book on their websites. And I thought, why not? If I don't like it, I'll just say that I don't like it. But if I do like it, then I've gotten a good book for free, and I've had the chance to share it with others, and it could be fun. And so I accepted, and actually I have to say that I did enjoy the book. There were a couple things that I thought maybe could have been fixed a little bit, but maybe that's just my inner editor coming out. All in all, I thought it was actually quite a fascinating read because he speaks incredibly eloquently. The author, Bernie Krause, he speaks very eloquently about his experiences recording sounds. And he's done that for lots of reasons. Some for commercial reasons. He's been collecting recordings for movies, for example. But then eventually he became an academic as well, and so he actually went out to study these sounds. And it's really amazing to think how you can learn a lot about an ecosystem by just going out and listening to it and seeing what sorts of sounds you can hear and what these sounds mean about what animals are there and what the habitat is like. And so I really enjoyed kind of thinking about noise from a completely different perspective and thinking about sound in general and kind of paying attention to this sense that humans often neglect a little bit. So we're very, visual and sight-based, but this really emphasizes what we can learn by listening quite hard. And I've chosen an excerpt here that talks about the kind of different sorts of sounds that you can hear if you go into a forest. If you go into a forest and hear the different types of weather that are there and what the forest would sound like depending on what the environment is like. Rain creates differing acoustic expressions depending on the force of the downpour and environment, urban, rural, or natural. Various weather dynamics over land and sea result in acoustic experiences that even acoustic ecologists sometimes miss, but that are nevertheless extremely varied. Storm cells in tropical rainforests tend to pass by every afternoon, even in the dry season. When they do, the dense wall of falling water sounds like a freight train approaching. It moves remarkably fast. In a matter of a minute or so from the time you first hear thunder, the deluge advances with a force so powerful that it is always breathtaking to be caught in. Because the vegetation in the upper canopies is so thick, the roar comes first from above, where the downpour initially hits. The full might of the rainstorm often fails to strike the forest floor directly. What you hear are melodic drips on the leaves, the sound of which depends on drop size, and periodic drips of water hitting small pools that have formed on the ground. In the best of stereo or surround recordings, we are able to capture this illusion of both near and distant rain events all at once. Just as quickly, though, the surge passes, the whole episode not lasting more than 3 or 4 minutes. If trees haven't toppled on you or your mics, you'll hear the rainforest insects begin to stridulate as the cell recedes into the distance. First one creature, then dozens, then thousands. As if cued by an unseen hand, and building dynamically like a great performance of Samuel Barber's Adagio for strings. The birds will then start to fill the unoccupied acoustic slots until the forest is once again alive with a complex sonic texture that builds, climaxes, and shifts when the next cell forms, or as time swings from late afternoon to dusk. The Sumatra and the mid-Amazon forests are my favorite places to witness moments like these, and the performance repeats in one form or another almost every day. And on that note, that very poetic note, just as I promised, I'm going to have another quick break, and we will listen to Birds of a Feather by the Civil Wars. Welcome back to the Wild Side with your host, Caitlin Kite, and the Civil Wars, singing Birds of a Feather. And today, in case you are just joining us, we are talking about science and nature writing. That is excellent if you are looking for a book to read over the holiday season, or you're looking to get a present maybe for someone. And the next person on my list is an academic that has done an excellent job crossing over into kind of the public nature of science. So he does a lot of stuff with books, and he does a lot of TV shows, and he's on the radio a whole bunch. So he's kind of become an academic celebrity, and that is Richard Dawkins. And I could choose a number of books of Richard's to talk about here on air. He's written several things that have really sold extremely well and have brought some very complicated scientific ideas to a lot of people who aren't into science at all. And those are things like The Selfish Gene, The Blind Watchmaker, The God Delusion, and The Ancestor's Tale, just to name a few. And all of those are excellent books, and he's made some amazing contributions to kind of lots of different ideas and how we think about science. But the one that I want to talk about today is The Greatest Show on Earth. And this is a book where he talks a lot about biodiversity and all of the different crazy things that we find on the planet, and why do we find this many things, and why do we find them in the forms that we do. And he just has some fun kind of highlighting these really interesting species that we have and often don't know about because they're kind of obscure, or they're from really far away places, or there aren't many of them. And I just kind of lucked into this book because my husband got it as a present from someone and happened to have it lying around the house, and so I started reading it one day. when I wasn't reading anything else, and I really was just sucked in, and I had a very hard time putting it down. So this is an excerpt from The Greatest Show on Earth. Darwin's treatment of human evolution in his most famous work On the Origin of Species is limited to 12 portentous words. Light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history. That is the wording in the first edition, which is the edition I always cite unless otherwise stated. By the sixth and last edition, Darwin allowed himself to stretch a point, and the sentence became, "Much light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history." I like to think of his pen poised over the fifth edition, while the great man judiciously pondered whether to indulge himself in the luxury of much. Even with it, the sentence is a calculated understatement. Darwin deliberately deferred his treatment of human evolution to another book, The Descent of Man. Perhaps it is not surprising that the 2 volumes of that later work devote more space to the topic of its subtitle, Selection in Relation to Sex, investigated largely in birds, than to human evolution. Not surprising, because at the time of Darwin's writing, there were no fossils at all linking us to our closest relatives among the apes. Darwin had only living apes to look at, and he used them well, arguing correctly, and almost alone, that our closest living relatives were all African, gorillas and chimpanzees. Bonobos were not recognized as separate from chimpanzees in those days, but they are African too. And therefore predicting that, if ancestral human fossils were ever to be found, Africa was the place to search. Darwin regretted the paucity of fossils, but he maintained a robustly bullish attitude to it. Citing Lyell, his mentor and the great geologist of the time, he pointed out that, in all the vertebrate classes, the discovery of fossil remains has been an extremely slow and fortuitous process, and added, "Nor should it be forgotten that those regions which are most likely to afford remains, connecting man with some extinct ape-like creature, have not as yet been searched by geologists." He meant Africa, and the quest was not helped by the fact that his immediate successors largely ignored his advice and searched Asia instead. And I think you can tell from that passage that Dawkins is a fantastic writer with lots of kind of poetic sentences and very intricate diction, but it's really engrossing, and he just kind of takes you along for the ride, and I definitely recommend that or any other of his kind of landmark works. Now the next and final bit of nonfiction on my list before I move on to a bit of poetry is by Tim Burkhead, who, again, I'm sorry, I keep revisiting birds. He is an ornithologist and also an academic that has had some success translating over his knowledge to kind of a lay audience. And he's written a couple of books that I could talk about as well, but the one that I have chosen here is the one that came out a few years ago called The Wisdom of Birds, an illustrated history of ornithology. And as you can tell by the name, this is something that has lots of great images in it, and it's well worth the purchase if you want to look at all of the beautiful drawings and photographs that he's got in this rather hefty book, actually, so you do get a lot for your money. But also in this book are some amazing tales of the sorts of things that Tim and other ornithologists like him have learned while out in the field studying birds. And the section that I'm going to talk about or read from here is talking about some of the stuff that Tim himself has done out in the field, and you really get a sense of what it's like to be a biologist out in the conditions, roughing it, trying to get a good sample size to study. Somewhat unsteadily, I am standing waist-deep in very cold water in the midst of a vast open wetland. As part of a team of ornithologists trying to capture one of Europe's rarest and most unusual birds, I am holding a vertical bamboo cane attached to a 12-meter-long fine net, mounted at the other end on a second bamboo cane and held taut by a colleague. There are 3 nets in total, and 6 of us, all in chest waders, are advancing gingerly on a pincher movement towards a tiny bird singing from a sprig of willow that protrudes from the water. At a predetermined signal, we attempt to turn towards our target, keeping the nets vertical, but it is like running in treacle, and I am aware of how ludicrous we look. Startled by our movements, the little bird makes a bid for freedom, and flies between the poles, but as though by magic falls securely into my net. I cannot stop laughing. It seems unbelievable that such a ridiculously inelegant operation could result in the capture of such a special bird. In the hand, the aquatic warbler is a tiny streak of brown feathers distinguished by a prominently striped black and gold head. As is obvious from the sexual swelling between his legs, this is a male. Otherwise, he is identical in appearance to the more rarely seen female. We place a single metal ring and a unique combination of plastic rings on his legs, take a drop of blood for DNA analysis, and let him go. And if you are interested in that book, again, I will tell you the title is The Wisdom of Birds, An Illustrated History of Ornithology. And other selections by Tim include Bird Sense, which is one that just came out this year and has a lovely flamingo on the front, The Red Canary, and also A Brand New Bird. Now, as I said, that will be the last nonfiction of the day. There are also a few poems that I want to throw in there. And I know that poems seem like a bit of a departure since I normally am talking about very non-fictional sorts of things and I'm talking about facts and whatnot. But I actually think that there are some really fantastic nature poems, and actually some science poems as well, that are really great at just expressing kind of the beauty of nature and capturing the behaviors of animals. And sometimes when you become a scientist, you kind of step back a little bit from those lovely, beautiful things that you see out in the wild. And I actually used to be a poet myself. That was the first thing I ever published, was a poem. And because I do so much science writing now, I find that virtually impossible. I just don't have that skill anymore because everything is very cut and dry and there's a lot of data and fact. But it is quite nice to read these poems because they do kind of have a bit more life than some of the other things I read and write in my daily life. So the first of these is a poem by Billy Collins from his book Ballistics, and the poem is called Ornithography. And Billy is a fantastic writer. He was Poet Laureate of the USA. And this is kind of a short poem from one of only many of his books. And it is a great example of the kind of humor and brevity, but also really descriptiveness that characterize his poems. And he starts with a small quote, just to give you a little bit of context. He says, "The legendary Kang Ji was said to have invented writing after observing the tracks of birds." And here is his poem. "A light snow last night, and now the earth falls open to a fresh page. A high wind is breaking up the clouds. Children wait for the yellow bus in a huddle, and under the feeder, some birds are busy writing short stories, poems, and letters to their mothers. A crow is working on an editorial. That chickadee is etching a list, and a robin walks back and forth, composing the opening to her autobiography. All so prolific this morning, these expressive little creatures, and each with an alphabet of only 2 letters." Now the next poem on my list is by a woman named Mary Oliver, who is also a very well-known American poet. And this is from her book, The Truro Bear and Other Adventures, which I thought was appropriate, actually, given where we are here in Cornwall. And this particular poem is called Carrying the Snake to the Garden. And this is another fantastic book of poetry. And actually, Billy Collins' book, Ballistics, is about all sorts of things. But Mary Oliver's, most of her focus is actually nature and kind of nature-related type things. So if you want a full book of nature poetry, this is definitely the way to go, because she looks at habitats and animals and plants and the interactions of all these things. She just has one poem after the other that's all about appreciating nature. So here is her poem, Carrying the Snake to the Garden. "In the cellar was the smallest snake I have ever seen. It coiled itself in a corner and watched me, with eyes like 2 little stars set into coal, and a tail that quivered. One step of my foot and it fled like a running shoelace, but a scoop of the wrist and I had it in my hand. I was sorry for the fear, so I hurried upstairs and out the kitchen door to the warm grass and the sunlight and the garden. It turned and turned in my hand, but when I put it down, it didn't move. I thought it was going to flow up my leg and into my pocket. I thought for a moment, as it lifted its face, it was going to sing, and then it was gone." And I have one last quick little poem, just to add to the list. And this is from one of 2 books that I have that are collections of poetry about birds. And I'm sure that surprises you that I should have 2 of these, but I do. And the first book is one that came out a few years ago, and it has drawings from Sibley, who is, you guys may not be familiar with him as much here in the UK, but he is a fantastic bird artist and considered one of the finest bird artists probably ever, but certainly in the contemporary art world. And he illustrated some really beautiful nature guides, bird guides in the U.S., and has illustrated this collection of bird poetry that came out a couple of years ago. But the one that I'm going to read from today is called The Poetry of Birds, and unlike the other book, this is actually a British collection, or a collection that's been put together by British editors, one of whom is actually based up in Bristol right now. He is a correspondent for the BBC, so he is someone who is kind of a West Country person, so I thought it would be good to talk about his book here on the station. And he and Simon Armitage, sorry I didn't mention his name, Tim Dee. So Tim Dee and Simon Armitage together put together this book called The Poetry of Birds. And I am going to read one of the poems, which is called My Crow. And unfortunately I've forgotten to write down the name of the author of this particular poem, but I will make sure that I put that on the website where I will have information on all of these things. So here we go. A crow flew into the tree outside my window. It was not Ted Hughes' crow, or Galway's crow, or Frost's, Pasternak's, or Lorca's crow, or one of Homer's crows, stuffed with gore after the battle. This was just a crow that never fit in anywhere in its life, or did anything worth mentioning. It sat there on the branch for a few minutes, then picked up and flew beautifully out of my life. And I liked that quite a lot. Unfortunately, my very favorite poem, which is a bird poem, it's just too long to read here on air. I won't bore you guys with that. But I will mention it on the Wildside webpage, along with lots of the other authors and books that I also would recommend that I just don't have time for here today. So definitely do check out the website. I hope you enjoyed these little excerpts today, and I hope you're inspired to check out at least one of them. And I'm going to finish up today with a song from Bruce Springsteen singing Secret Garden.